My father sent me a text message explicitly disowning me less than 24 hours before I walked down the aisle, all because I refused to force my stepmother's 4 children into my bridal party. He thought pulling his $50,000 catering check at the very last minute would break my spirit. He had no idea that 3 years later, I would be the absolute only person holding the pen to save him from a federal prison sentence. My name is Izzy. I am 33 years old, and I learned the hard way that blood does not always make you family. Before I continue my story, please let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off a toxic parent to protect your own peace. The morning before my wedding was supposed to be completely flawless. I was standing in the master suite of a gorgeous rented Hamptons estate staring at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The silk bodice of my custom gown fit perfectly. My closest friends were downstairs drinking champagne, and the crisp ocean breeze was drifting through the open balcony doors. I felt genuinely happy and relaxed for the first time in several grueling months of planning. Then my phone buzzed on the mahogany vanity. It was a single long text message from my father, Richard. I picked it up fully expecting a belated congratulations, or maybe a rare apology for skipping the rehearsal breakfast that morning. Instead, the heavy words on the screen made the blood drain from my face. The message read, "Izzy, if you are not going to include Lydia's 4 children as your official bridesmaids and groomsmen, then I simply do not have a daughter. Do not expect me to walk you down the aisle, and do not bother coming to our house ever again. You are incredibly selfish to exclude your new siblings on a day that should be about blending our family. Consider this my final goodbye to you. Oh, and I just canceled the $50,000 wire transfer for the wedding catering company. Have a nice life." I stood there frozen, just letting the sheer, calculated cruelty of his words sink in. He purposely waited until the caterers were literally loading their delivery trucks to pull the funding. He wanted me deeply panicked. He wanted me sobbing in my expensive wedding dress, begging him for the money, and promising to put his entitled stepchildren in the spotlight. That was his entire psychological playbook. For my entire life, Richard only ever used his wealth as a sharp weapon to control my behavior. Just last year, he quietly drained my remaining college trust fund to buy a luxury sport utility vehicle for Lydia's oldest son. When I dared to confront him about the stolen money, he aggressively gaslit me and told me I was being an ungrateful daughter. He fully expected me to cave today. He expected me to be the weak little girl who desperately craved her father's fleeting validation. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I did not drop to my knees in despair, and I certainly did not type out a frantic pleading apology text. Instead, I felt a strange icy sense of absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I calmly walked over to my leather overnight bag and pulled out my heavy titanium black card. I had built a highly successful and ruthless career as a venture capital executive in New York City over the last decade. It was a massive career my father completely ignored because my wealth did not directly benefit his new wife. $50,000 was merely a fraction of my yearly corporate bonus. I unlocked my phone and immediately dialed the head event planner for the venue. She answered after 2 short rings, sounding extremely stressed about the sudden missing wire transfer from my father's account. I firmly told her not to worry about his canceled payment, and I slowly read her my black card number to cover the entire catering balance, plus a generous tip right then and there. I could hear her sigh in massive relief, but I was not finished speaking yet. I then instructed her to completely remove the 2 massive head tables originally reserved for the Reed family. I told her to strike my father, my stepmother, and all 4 of her children from the security guest list at the main gate. If any of them try to enter the property, you turn them away immediately, I said coldly. They are permanently banned from attending my entire wedding ceremony and all related weekend events, period. Exactly 10 minutes after I ended the call with the wedding planner, my phone began vibrating. The screen flashed with a picture of my older sister, Isla. A naive part of me hoped she was calling to offer some sisterly comfort or to tell me our father had completely lost his mind. But I knew better. Isla had spent her entire life acting as our father's dedicated echo chamber, always agreeing with his demands to ensure she stayed in his good graces. I took a deep breath and answered. Before I could say hello, Isla launched into a vicious verbal assault. Izzy, I cannot believe you are being this selfish, she screamed. Dad is completely heartbroken over your stubbornness. You are single-handedly destroying this family right before your own wedding, all because you are too arrogant to let Lydia's kids stand at the altar. I stood perfectly still. Isla, I replied, my voice completely steady. Dad just pulled $50,000 from my wedding vendors at the absolute last minute to punish me. He explicitly told me he no longer has a daughter. Do you actually hear yourself right now? She scoffed loudly. He only did that because you pushed him to the absolute limit, Izzy. You are embarrassing all of us. In fact, Andre is sitting right next to me, and he is completely disgusted by your behavior. He cannot even believe he has to attend a wedding where the bride treats her own father like garbage. I closed my eyes. That specific lie was the final nail in the coffin. Her husband, Andre, was a brilliant African-American corporate defense attorney. He was a man of deep integrity who pulled himself up from nothing to become a partner at a top law firm. He and I shared a mutual respect because we both knew what it meant to work endlessly for everything we had. Andre would never use the word disgusted to describe me setting a healthy boundary. Isla was simply using her husband as a convenient moral shield to gaslight me. Do not put words in Andre's mouth, Isla, I shot back. We both know Andre is probably at his office right now billing hours. You are lying to manipulate me just like Dad always does. And do not pretend this is actually about Lydia's children being in the bridal party. This is about Dad realizing he can no longer control me with his wallet. Isla gasped, acting highly offended, but I cut her off. This is the exact same power trip he pulled last spring when he illegally drained my educational trust fund, I said with cold precision. That trust fund was meant to cover my Executive Master of Business Administration program. Instead, Dad emptied the entire account behind my back. And what did he do with that money, Isla? He bought a fully loaded luxury Range Rover for Lydia's oldest son, a 22-year-old boy who has never held a job. Dad had every right to reallocate those family funds, Isla argued, her voice wavering slightly. Lydia's son needed reliable transportation to get to his auditions. You were already making a high salary at your corporate firm, Izzy. You did not need the money. You are just being greedy and holding on to a pathetic grudge. It was not his money to reallocate, I stated firmly. It was my future, and he stole it to buy the affection of a woman who is bleeding him dry. And now, because I will not let him parade those same entitled kids around at my wedding, he is trying to financially ruin my big day. But it did not work, Isla. I already paid the caterer myself. His little extortion plan failed. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Isla was clearly processing the fact that I had just dropped $50,000 in cash without breaking a sweat. When she finally spoke, her voice was dripping with venom. You think you are so smart and so powerful now, Izzy, but you are going to deeply regret this, Aunt Beth. Aunt Martha and Aunt Joni are all flying in today. When we see you at the rehearsal dinner tonight, the entire family is going to demand a public apology. You are going to pay Dad back for every single dime he spent raising you, or you will walk down that aisle alone. I smiled to myself, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I look forward to seeing everyone tonight, Isla. Dress nicely. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The lines were officially drawn and the war had just begun. The rehearsal dinner was held at an exclusive Michelin-starred waterfront restaurant in Montauk. My fiancé and his wonderful parents had flown in from Chicago earlier that afternoon. They were warm, supportive people who had always treated me like the daughter they never had. The private dining room was bathed in soft candlelight, and the gentle sound of ocean waves crashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Looking around the long, elegantly set table, I noticed the glaring empty seats where my father and stepmother were supposed to sit. Richard had kept his promise to boycott the event. I felt a brief wave of genuine relief, thinking the evening might actually proceed peacefully, without his dark cloud hanging over us. That naive hope shattered the moment the heavy mahogany doors aggressively swung open. In walked my father's three sisters, Aunt Beth, Aunt Martha, and Aunt Joni. They marched into the room shoulder to shoulder like a heavily perfumed firing squad. They were dressed in overly formal stiff dresses, glaring at me with identical expressions of deep disapproval. My fiancé's mother politely stood up with a warm smile to greet them, but Aunt Beth completely ignored her outstretched hand. Instead, Beth marched directly to the head of the table where I was sitting. The entire room went dead silent. The soft jazz playing in the background suddenly felt incredibly loud and out of place. Waiters stopped midway through pouring wine, sensing the explosive tension. Isabella Aunt Beth barked, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We did not come here to eat your fancy food or celebrate this sham of a wedding. We came here because we are absolutely appalled by your vile behavior today." My fiancé shifted in his seat, ready to stand up and intervene, but I placed a gentle, firm hand on his knee to stop him. I looked up at Beth, keeping my face completely blank and composed. "Is that right, Aunt Beth?" I asked calmly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "Yes, it is right," she snapped, stepping closer so she could hover over me. "Your father is sitting at home right now having a literal panic attack because his own flesh and blood decided to treat his new wife and her children like absolute garbage. You have deeply humiliated him, Isabella. You have brought immense shame to the Reed family name right in front of all his country club friends." Aunt Martha chimed in from behind her, shaking her head dramatically, as if she were the victim. "After everything Richard sacrificed for you," she whined loudly. "He put a roof over your head, he clothed you, he paid for your wildly expensive private schools. And this is how you repay him, by banning his innocent stepchildren from walking down the aisle. You are a cold, heartless girl who only cares about herself." I briefly glanced at my fiancé's parents. They looked utterly horrified by this sudden ambush, but I refused to break eye contact with my raging aunts. The restaurant manager was hovering near the door, looking panicked and holding a radio, but I gave him a subtle, sharp nod to stay back. I actually wanted my fiancé's family to witness this. I wanted them to see exactly who these people truly were and why I was walking away from them. Aunt Beth slammed her manicured hand on the pristine white tablecloth, making the crystal wine glasses rattle violently. "You are going to pick up your phone right now and call your father," she demanded loudly, ensuring every single waiter and guest in the room heard her absurd ultimatum. "You are going to beg for his forgiveness, and you are going to write him a check to pay him back for every single dollar he wasted raising an ungrateful brat like you. If you do not, we will make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly what kind of monster you really are. You will be entirely cut off from this family permanently, and we will make sure your reputation in this city is ruined." Aunt Joni nodded vigorously in agreement, muttering under her breath about how children these days have absolutely no respect for their elders, and how my mother would be ashamed of me if she were still alive. That comment about my late mother was meant to be the killing blow. They stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to crack under the pressure. They fully expected me to burst into dramatic tears and run out of the restaurant in shame. They desperately wanted to break me in front of my new family to prove that my father still owned my emotions. The silence in the room was suffocating. My fiancé tightened his jaw, anger flashing dangerously in his eyes, but he trusted me enough to let me handle my own battles. I slowly set my linen napkin down on the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my silk rehearsal dress. I looked at the three bitter women who had spent my entire childhood enabling my father's narcissistic abuse. They truly thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought public humiliation was the ultimate weapon to force my compliance. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, Andre suddenly pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, breaking the suffocating tension. He stood up, towering over the three aunts with a calm but deeply stern expression. "Aunt Beth, please stop this right now," Andre said, his deep voice carrying an effortless authority. "This is absolutely not the time or the place for a family grievance. You are actively disrespecting Izzy's future in-laws, and you are ruining what is supposed to be a peaceful evening. We can discuss this privately tomorrow." He gestured toward the door, clearly trying to de-escalate the explosive situation before security had to get involved. I felt a brief flash of gratitude for my brother-in-law. He was the only person on that side of the family who possessed a shred of basic human decency. But that decency was immediately crushed. Ela lunged forward and grabbed Andre's forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Sit down, Andre," she hissed, her voice dripping with toxic authority. "Do not defend her. She is the one who started this war by disrespecting our father and treating Lydia's kids like garbage. You are my husband, and you will stand by my family. You do not get to play the peacemaker when my sister is actively destroying our father's mental health." Andre looked down at his wife, his jaw clenching tight. I could see the profound exhaustion in his eyes. This was the dark reality of his marriage to my sister. He was a highly respected partner at a prestigious law firm, but in this family, he was treated like an obedient prop meant to validate Isla's twisted worldview. Instead of fighting her in front of an audience, Andre slowly let out a heavy breath and sank back into his chair, massaging his temples. The peacemaker had been successfully silenced, leaving the floor wide open for the aunts to finish their public execution. Aunt Martha crossed her arms, wearing a smug, victorious smile. "Well, Isabella," she mocked, taking full advantage of Andre's retreat. "We are waiting. Are you going to call your father and apologize, or are you going to sit there and expect us to pay for this absurdly expensive dinner? We all know you cannot afford a place like this on your little assistant's salary." They honestly believed I was still the broke entry-level analyst I was 5 years ago. My father had deliberately kept them completely in the dark about my rapid rise to executive director at the venture capital firm. He preferred the narrative where I was a struggling failure who desperately needed his financial mercy. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned my head and made eye contact with the general manager who had been nervously hovering near the wine cellar. "Bring me the check, please," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "The entire table, everything we had tonight." Aunt Joni let out a loud, dramatic scoff. "Oh, please, Isabella, stop making a fool of yourself," she sneered loudly. "A dinner for 20 people at Belmont's is going to cost more than your car. Just stop this embarrassing charade and call Richard." The manager quickly approached, carrying a sleek black leather checkbook. He looked highly uncomfortable as he handed it directly to me. I flipped it open, glancing at the total. It was slightly over $20,000, including the premium vintage wines my father had pre-ordered before boycotting. Without a microsecond of hesitation, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my heavy metal corporate platinum card. The dull silver card caught the dim candlelight as I placed it firmly on top of the receipt. "Run it," I told the manager smoothly. "And please add a $5,000 tip for your staff for having to endure this completely unacceptable disruption." The manager nodded swiftly, swiping the card on his handheld terminal. It approved instantly with a soft beep. The collective gasp that erupted from my three aunts was absolute music to my ears. Aunt Beth's jaw practically hit the floor as she stared at the glowing green approved screen on the terminal. Isla suddenly looked incredibly pale, her eyes darting between the platinum card and my perfectly calm face. Their entire psychological weapon had just been neutralized with a single swipe of plastic. I picked up my card, slipped it back into my clutch, and looked directly at Aunt Beth. "I do not owe my father a single dime." I stated, my voice ice cold. "He stole my college fund to buy a car for a child that is not even his. So you can take your fake outrage and your pathetic demands back to him. Have a lovely evening, ladies." I turned to my fiancé's parents, giving them an apologetic smile before taking my fiancé's hand. We walked out of the private dining room, leaving my utterly stunned family suffocating in their own toxic silence. As we reached the grand lobby of the restaurant, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text from Richard. "Since you want to act like you are completely independent, you are officially cut off." The message read, "I am calling my lawyers first thing Monday morning to have you permanently removed from the deed to your grandmother's $8 million coastal property. Good luck paying for your pathetic life now." 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. The massive fallout from my wedding weekend permanently severed my ties with the Reed family. I never called my father. He never called me. I married the love of my life in a beautiful, intimate ceremony surrounded entirely by my husband's warm family and my closest friends. True to his word, Richard had immediately contacted his attorneys to try and rip my name off my grandmother's coastal property deed. But my grandmother had been a remarkably shrewd woman. She had legally structured that specific deed as an ironclad, irrevocable co-ownership. He could not remove me, and he could not sell the property without my explicit physical signature. I simply ignored his angry legal letters and focused entirely on building my empire. At 33 years old, I was sitting at the head of a massive frosted glass conference table in a corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I had recently been promoted to senior managing partner at Vanguard Crest, one of the most ruthless and successful venture capital firms on the East Coast. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, low bun. Across the table sat the sweaty, trembling chief executive officer of a tech startup we had heavily invested in 2 years prior. He had spent the last 20 minutes trying to hide a massive hemorrhage in his quarterly earnings report, using confusing jargon and inflated projections. I held up a single finger, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Stop talking, David," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume. The entire boardroom fell deathly silent. My junior analyst stopped typing. "You are burning through $3 million a month on bloated marketing campaigns, while your core product retention rate has dropped by 40%. You are not experiencing a temporary market fluctuation. You are failing." David swallowed hard, loosening his expensive silk tie. "Isabella, if you just give us another 6 months to pivot our strategy." I slid a thick black folder across the table toward him. "I am not giving you 6 months, David. I am giving you exactly 48 hours to step down from your position and hand over total operational control to the board. If you refuse, I will personally trigger the breach of contract clause in our funding agreement and freeze every single asset your company currently holds. Your corporate credit cards will decline by dinner time. You have until Wednesday morning to clear out your desk." I stood up, buttoning my jacket, signaling that the meeting was officially over. As David scrambled out of the room looking thoroughly defeated, my lead analyst handed me a fresh espresso. "You do not miss a beat, Izzy," she murmured respectfully. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, staring out at the chaotic city streets below. I had learned to be merciless from the absolute best teacher in the world. I had learned how to spot weakness and financial vulnerability from the man who used it against his own daughter. While I was systematically crushing failing executives from my penthouse office, my father Richard was secretly living out his own personal financial nightmare back in the Connecticut suburbs. For the last 3 years, he had worked desperately to maintain the pristine illusion of upper-class wealth. He continued playing golf at the country club. He continued hosting lavish holiday parties, but behind closed doors, his bank accounts were bleeding out rapidly. Lydia, my stepmother, had methodically and ruthlessly drained his entire retirement savings. Her 4 children treated Richard like a limitless automated teller machine. He had paid for 2 extravagant out-of-state weddings. He had fully funded a failing restaurant venture for Lydia's oldest son. He had covered the massive credit card debts of her twin daughters, who refused to work. Richard was deeply terrified of losing Lydia, so he simply kept writing the checks, hoping his own failing real estate business would miraculously bounce back and cover the staggering losses. It did not bounce back. It crashed spectacularly. I knew all of this because I made it my personal business to know. One of the many perks of being a senior partner at a multi-billion-dollar investment firm was having unparalleled access to elite financial analysts and private investigators. Every quarter, I had a quiet background check run on Richard's businesses. It was not out of concern. It was out of strategic preparation. I knew a financial collapse was mathematically inevitable, and I wanted to be fully prepared for the exact moment he became desperate enough to try and sell my grandmother's land. According to the latest confidential report sitting on my desk, Richard had taken out a massive secret second mortgage on his primary residence. He had maxed out every personal line of credit available to him. The bank had already issued 2 private warnings regarding delinquent payments. The shiny luxury cars in his driveway were one missed payment away from being quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. Richard was drowning, and the water was rapidly rising above his neck. He had completely exhausted every single financial resource except for one: the pristine $8 million stretch of untouched coastal land my grandmother had left us. It was his final golden ticket out of complete bankruptcy. But there was a massive, unmovable boulder blocking his path to salvation. He needed my signature. While I was reviewing term sheets in my Manhattan office, Richard was sweating inside a sterile, aggressively air-conditioned conference room at a regional bank in Connecticut. Across the large table sat 2 senior loan officers whose cold faces were completely devoid of any human sympathy. The man who had once terrified our family with his booming voice was now nervously tapping his gold watch. The bankers had just handed him documents outlining immediate foreclosure proceedings on his sprawling estate. "Mr. Reed," the older loan officer began, his tone flat and administrative, "you have missed your last 4 mortgage payments. Your secondary line of credit is entirely maxed out, and the grace period on your business loans expired 2 weeks ago. Unless you can produce $1.2 million in liquid cash by this Friday, the bank will begin officially seizing your assets. This includes the primary residence and the 2 luxury vehicles currently registered to your wife, Lydia." Richard swallowed hard, pulling at his collar. He forced a wide, charismatic smile, trying to play the part of the seasoned real estate veteran who just hit a minor speed bump. "Gentlemen, there is absolutely no need for such drastic measures," he said smoothly. "I am well aware of the current deficit, but I came here today to present you with a permanent solution." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy folder, sliding it proudly across the table. "I am selling the coastal property in Rhode Island," Richard announced, leaning back to regain some illusion of power, "the $8 million parcel my mother left behind. I have secured a motivated corporate buyer called Horizon Development Holdings. They are offering pure cash and want to close within 30 days. I have the preliminary sale agreement right here. If you give me a slight extension, I can pay off every single debt I owe this bank." The 2 bankers exchanged a skeptical glance before the older one picked up the folder. He adjusted his glasses and began carefully reading the legal jargon. For a brief moment, Richard actually thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system and secured his golden ticket to keep Lydia and her greedy children satisfied. He proudly pulled out his custom-engraved silver fountain pen, eagerly getting ready to sign the bank extension papers. But the loan officer did not reach for the pen. Instead, he frowned deeply and flipped to the second page of the property deed attached to the back of the file. "Mr. Reed," the banker said slowly, tapping his index finger against a specific highlighted paragraph, "this deed clearly states that the property is held in an irrevocable co-ownership trust." Richard laughed loudly and waved his hand in a highly dismissive manner. "Yes, my mother set it up years ago. I am the primary executor of her estate, so I have the legal authority to liquidate the asset. Just show me where to sign for the extension." "You do not understand," the banker interrupted, his voice growing noticeably firmer. "You are not the sole owner of this property. Your name is on the deed, but so is your daughter's, Isabella Reed. And because this is an irrevocable joint tenancy, you cannot legally sell, transfer, or alter the status of this property without her explicit physical signature. You do not have the authority to accept any corporate offer alone." The blood instantly drained from Richard's face. He stared at the banker as if the man had just spoken a foreign language. "That is completely ridiculous," Richard sputtered, slamming his fist on the table. "She has not spoken to me in 3 years. She has absolutely nothing to do with my finances. I am her father. I make the financial decisions for that land." "The law does not care that you are her father," the younger banker chimed in cleanly, shutting down his arrogant outburst. "The law only cares whose name is registered with the county clerk. If you want to sell that land to Horizon Development Holdings, you need Isabella Reed to sign this exact contract. Until she does this, Property is completely useless as collateral. Richard sat completely frozen, the expensive pen slipping from his sweaty fingers. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He had spent 3 years pretending I did not exist. He proudly told his country club friends he had disowned his ungrateful daughter. And now, with his fake empire crumbling, he was trapped. The only person standing between him and total financial ruin was the daughter he had cruelly cast aside. The older loan officer slid the heavy foreclosure notice back across the polished wooden table. You must get your daughter's physical signature immediately or start packing your boxes. Exactly 47 minutes after my father was handed that crushing ultimatum inside the Connecticut bank, my personal cell phone buzzed silently on my glass desk in Manhattan. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly complex merger acquisition file. I rarely answered personal texts during market hours, but the name flashing on the screen made me pause. It was Richard, the man who had not spoken a single word to me in 3 entire years, the man who had publicly disowned me on the eve of my wedding. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It read, "Hey, Izzy. Missing my little girl today. Life is just too short to hold on to silly grudges, and family is forever. Let us get lunch this week. My treat. Love, Dad." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a sudden sharp wave of pure disgust wash over me. The absolute audacity of the message was almost breathtaking. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the horrific things he and my aunts had done at my rehearsal dinner. He simply waved away 3 years of total estrangement as a silly grudge. He was trying to effortlessly slide back into my life, using the exact same manipulative gaslighting tactics he had used since my childhood. But I knew my father better than anyone else on the planet. Richard Reed never reached out unless he desperately needed something. His sudden, overwhelming urge to reconnect was entirely transactional. I did not reply. Instead, I hit a button on my desk console connecting me directly to my lead forensic accountant, Evan. Evan was a brilliant former federal investigator who now worked exclusively for my division at Vanguard Crest. "Evan, I need a deep dive on a personal target," I said, my voice completely detached. "Richard Reed, Connecticut resident. I want his full debt profile, credit utilization, and any pending legal or real estate transactions. I need it on my monitors in 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, my massive curved office monitors lit up with a staggering amount of financial data. Evan had bypassed the standard credit bureaus and pulled direct filings from the county clerk's office. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, slowly digesting the absolute train wreck that was my father's current financial reality. It was significantly worse than my previous quarterly background checks had indicated. My eyes scanned the brightly colored graphs and highlighted legal documents Evan had aggregated. Richard was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of debt. I saw the massive second mortgage he had secretly taken out on his primary residence. I saw the 6 maxed-out premium credit cards carrying exorbitant interest rates. And then right in the center of the screen was the smoking gun. A digitized copy of a formal foreclosure notice filed by his regional bank just that morning. He was officially going bankrupt. He was mere days away from losing the sprawling luxury estate he used to project his fake upper-class image. He was going to lose the expensive cars and the country club membership. Lydia and her entitled children had completely bled him dry, just as I had silently predicted they would. But Evan had flagged one more crucial document at the bottom of the screen. I clicked on the file, opening a preliminary commercial real estate contract. It was a drafted sale agreement for a stretch of coastal land in Rhode Island. My grandmother's land. The contract listed the purchase price at exactly $8 million in liquid cash. The prospective buyer was listed as Horizon Development Holdings. Suddenly, every single puzzle piece snapped perfectly into place. I let out a low, dark laugh that echoed in the empty penthouse office. Richard was trying to sell my grandmother's property to save himself from total financial ruin. But he could not execute the sale because my name was permanently etched onto the irrevocable deed. The bank had cornered him. The buyers were waiting. He was completely paralyzed. He did not miss his little girl. He did not suddenly realize that family is forever. He realized that I was the absolute only human being on earth who possessed the legal authority to sign that deed and rescue him from poverty. He wanted to buy me a cheap lunch, emotionally manipulate me with fake paternal affection, and then trick me into signing away my half of an $8 million inheritance so he could pay off Lydia's ridiculous debts. I picked up my phone and looked at his pathetic text message one more time. He truly believed I was still the naive, desperate daughter who would eagerly jump at the slightest crumb of his attention. He was playing checkers while I was playing three-dimensional chess. I slowly typed out my response. Lunch sounds great, Richard. My office. Friday at noon. I hit send and smiled. The trap was officially set. After sending that text message, I turned my attention back to the brightly lit monitors illuminating my quiet office. The digital file for Horizon Development Holdings was still open on the right screen. To anyone outside of the elite financial sector, Horizon looked like a standard, aggressive commercial real estate developer. They had a sleek website, a board of directors, and a registered corporate office in Delaware. But the truth was far more complex and infinitely more satisfying. I clicked into the corporate lineage report Evan had carefully prepared. Horizon Development Holdings was a subsidiary of a larger real estate trust called Summit Capital, and Summit Capital had been fully acquired 18 months ago by my specific division at Vanguard Crest. I was the senior managing partner who personally signed off on that massive acquisition, which meant that I was the ultimate shadow owner of Horizon Development Holdings. When my analysts first alerted me last month that Richard was quietly shopping my grandmother's coastal property around to private buyers, I knew exactly what I had to do. My grandmother was a brilliant woman who always saw right through my father's greedy facade. She structured that irrevocable co-ownership deed specifically to protect the land from being squandered on his terrible investments. But she also gave me the ultimate weapon to use when the time was right. I immediately instructed the acquisitions team at Horizon to approach his real estate broker with an all-cash offer of $8 million. It was an offer so wildly lucrative and fast that no desperate man drowning in debt could possibly refuse. Richard took the bait immediately. He practically tripped over himself to sign the preliminary documents with my shell company. The beautiful irony of the entire situation made me laugh out loud in the empty penthouse. My father was currently sitting in his sprawling, heavily mortgaged house, believing he had outsmarted his bank and his creditors by securing a massive corporate buyout. He was banking his entire future, his freedom, and his marriage on the deep pockets of Horizon Development. He had absolutely no idea that the faceless corporate entity he was desperately praying to was actually the very daughter he threw away like garbage. I was the buyer. I was the seller. I was the bank. I was holding every single card in the deck and he was playing with an empty hand. I picked up my desk phone and dialed Evan's extension. He answered on the first ring. Evan, I need you to contact the legal team representing Horizon Development, I instructed smoothly. Tell them to send an aggressive follow-up email to Richard Reed's broker. I want them to firmly state that the $8 million cash offer expires in exactly 7 days. Make them sound highly impatient. Tell them they have other investment properties in Rhode Island lined up, and they are not willing to wait for his internal family disputes to be resolved. Tell them the corporate board is actively considering pulling out of the deal entirely if the CO owner's signature is not secured immediately. Understood, Izzy, Evan replied, his tone sharp and professional. I will have the legal department draft the pressure notice right now. He is going to be sweating bullets by dinner time. That is exactly the point, Evan, I said. Thank you. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. By artificially tightening the timeline, I was forcing Richard to act recklessly. He would not have time to hire competent lawyers to review the fine print or search for alternative legal loopholes. He would be completely blinded by pure financial panic. The artificial deadline would guarantee that he showed up at my Manhattan office on Friday, utterly desperate for my signature on that deed. But I also knew my father never fought his battles alone. He always used his family as a human shield to guilt-trip his targets into submission. He would not come to my office by himself. He would absolutely bring Lydia to play the role of the tearful, remorseful mother figure. And he would undoubtedly drag my sister Isla along to act as his aggressive attack dog. They would try to overwhelm me with a highly coordinated emotional ambush. I welcomed it. I wanted all of them in my office at the exact same time. I wanted the people who stood by and happily watched my public execution at the rehearsal dinner to witness my ultimate ascension. They thought they were walking into a simple lunch meeting to manipulate a naive, estranged family member. They had no idea they were marching directly into a highly orchestrated corporate slaughterhouse. I closed the Horizon file on my monitor and opened my master calendar. I blocked out my entire Friday afternoon. Then I called my executive assistant to arrange for building security to grant Richard Reed and his guests unrestricted access to my penthouse floor. I wanted them to be thoroughly intimidated by the marble floors, the glass walls, and the silent efficiency of my staff. I wanted them to see every ounce of my staggering wealth and power the moment they stepped off the private elevator. The stage was perfectly set. Friday at noon arrived precisely on schedule. I sat behind my massive glass desk, watching the live security feed on my monitor. The private elevator doors slid open, revealing Richard, Lydia, and Isla. They stepped onto the penthouse floor and immediately froze. I could see their eyes darting wildly around the sprawling reception area, taking in the imported Italian marble floors, the towering floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and the hushed, highly intimidating atmosphere of elite corporate wealth. For a brief second, the sheer scale of my success genuinely terrified them. They had spent the last 3 years convincing themselves I was a bitter failure. Now they were standing inside a multi-billion-dollar financial fortress that I commanded, but their intimidation quickly morphed into forced arrogance. It was their default defense mechanism. I watched on the screen as Isla flipped her hair and loudly made a snide comment to the receptionist, criticizing the minimalist modern art hanging on the wall. Richard puffed out his chest, straightening his cheap off-the-rack suit, attempting to project an aura of authority he no longer possessed. He loudly demanded to see his daughter, acting as if he owned the entire building. My executive assistant, a fiercely professional woman, who had been fully briefed on the situation, calmly stood up. She did not offer them anything to drink. She did not offer a polite smile. She simply gestured toward the heavy frosted glass doors of my corner office and led the way. The doors swung open, and the 3 of them marched in. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I remained perfectly still, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers. The silence in the room was intentionally oppressive. Lydia decided to make the first move. She launched into a highly rehearsed theatrical performance. "Oh, Izzy, my sweet girl," she cried out, forcing a painful, artificial tremor into her voice. She rushed across the room, arms spread wide fully, intending to pull me into a tearful, motherly embrace. I simply pushed my chair back, rolling 2 feet to the left. Lydia awkwardly missed her target entirely, grasping at empty air before stumbling slightly against the edge of my desk. Her fake tears instantly evaporated, replaced by a brief flash of pure, angry embarrassment. She quickly composed herself, smoothing down her wrinkled blouse and taking a step back. Richard cleared his throat aggressively, trying to regain control of the room. "Isabella," he said, using his deep, authoritative tone, "it is good to see you. You have done quite well for yourself here. But family is what truly matters at the end of the day." I stared at him, letting his empty words hang in the freezing air of the office. He looked significantly older than I remembered. The heavy stress of his impending bankruptcy had carved deep lines into his face, and his fake confident smile was visibly trembling at the edges. Isla stood behind him, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered jealousy. She was taking in my tailored designer suit, my luxury watch, and the breathtaking view behind me. She despised the fact that I had built an empire while she was secretly drowning in debt, right alongside our father. "Let us skip the pathetic theater, Richard," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "You did not come to Manhattan because you suddenly remembered you had a daughter. You did not come here to apologize for disowning me the day before my wedding, and you certainly did not come here to catch up over a friendly lunch." I dropped my hands to the desk and leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly how you operate. You only reach out when you need something. So let us save everyone in this room a tremendous amount of time. I opened a sleek silver pen and clicked it once. The sharp metallic sound echoed loudly in the quiet room, making Isla flinch. Tell me exactly how much money you are here to beg for, I demanded coldly. Richard physically recoiled as if I had just slapped him across the face. Lydia's jaw dropped open in fake horror as she dramatically clutched the expensive pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. Isla immediately stepped forward, her face turning bright red with intense rage. "How dare you speak to our father that way, Izzy?" she practically screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "He came here out of the goodness of his heart to mend this fractured family, and you are treating him like a common beggar. You are a cold, heartless monster who only cares about money." Isla's voice echoed off the thick glass walls of my office, but I did not even blink. I kept my eyes locked on Richard, waiting for his mask to slip. And it did. The fake paternal warmth instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating glare I remembered so vividly from my childhood. He realized Lydia crying and Isla screaming would not break my focus. The emotional theater had failed. It was time for him to play his final desperate hand. Richard reached into his leather briefcase and yanked out a thick stack of legal documents. He stepped forward and slammed the heavy manila folder directly onto the center of my immaculate glass desk. The loud smack made both Lydia and Isla jump. "Since you want to act like a corporate shark, we will do this your way," Richard growled, dropping the polite facade entirely. "I am selling your grandmother's Rhode Island property. I have a highly motivated corporate buyer named Horizon Development Holdings, offering $8 million in pure cash. They want to close the deal by the end of the month, but because of the archaic way your grandmother structured that damn trust, I need your physical signature to release the deed." I slowly looked down at the contract resting on my desk and then back up at him. "You want me to sign away my half of an $8 million inheritance so you can pay off the massive second mortgage you secretly took out on your house?" I asked, my tone completely flat. "Or perhaps you need the cash to cover the maxed-out credit cards Lydia is hiding in her designer purse." Lydia gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. "How did you know about those?" she stammered, her face turning a sickly shade of pale. Richard ignored her, snapping his fingers loudly to pull my attention back to him. "Do not pretend you care about my finances, Isabella. You live in a penthouse and run a multi-billion-dollar firm. You do not need this land, and you certainly do not need the money. But because I am a fair man, and because you are still my daughter, I am willing to offer you a highly generous concession." He leaned over the desk, planting his knuckles on the glass. "If you sign this contract today, I will authorize the escrow company to wire you a 5% cut of the final sale. That is $400,000 in clean tax-free cash. Consider it a very generous belated wedding gift from your father." I stared at him, letting the sheer absurdity of his offer hang in the air. He was asking me to legally surrender $4 million of my rightful inheritance in exchange for a pathetic $400,000 bribe. He was completely bankrupt, desperate, and cornered. Yet he still possessed the sheer arrogance to try and aggressively lowball me in my own office. Before I could even articulate my absolute disgust, Isla aggressively shoved her way past Richard and slammed her hands down next to his. She was vibrating with toxic entitlement. "You are going to take that deal, Izzy?" she hissed venomously. "You are going to sign that paper right now, and you are going to help our father. He raised you. He fed you. He gave you the education that allowed you to sit in this fancy chair. You owe him your life." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. "I owe this man absolutely nothing, Isla. He spent my college trust fund on a luxury car for Lydia's son. So you can take your 5% wedding gift and walk right out of my building." Isla narrowed her eyes, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "If you refuse to sign that document, Izzy, we will destroy you," she threatened loudly. "Andre and I have already spoken to several top litigators in Connecticut. If you withhold this signature and force our father into bankruptcy, we will file a massive civil lawsuit against you for intentional elder abuse." We will publicly claim that you are maliciously weaponizing a family trust to inflict severe financial and emotional distress on an aging senior citizen. I could not help it. I let out a sharp laugh. You are going to sue a senior managing partner of a Wall Street venture capital firm for elder abuse because I refused to sign over my own legal property? I asked, mocking her blatantly. Do you have any idea how fast my corporate legal team would get that frivolous garbage thrown out of court, Isla? Andre is a smart man. There is absolutely no way he agreed to back such a legally brain-dead strategy. You are lying again. Isla clamped her mouth shut, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. She knew I had just caught her in a massive lie. Andre was a meticulous corporate defense attorney, and he would absolutely never jeopardize his own legal license by threatening a completely baseless elder abuse lawsuit against a venture capital executive. I dismissed my sister with a slow blink and calmly shifted my attention back to the thick manila folder resting on my glass desk. Richard let out a heavy sigh, attempting to regain control of the room. Just look at the paperwork, Isabella. He urged, his tone shifting back to a pleading manipulation. Horizon Development is a massive holding company. They are not going to wait forever. I have already negotiated the absolute best possible terms for us. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line, and we can both walk away with a massive pile of cash. I did not respond to his bait. I simply reached out and flipped the thick title page of the contract over to examine the secondary clauses. As a senior managing partner, I had personally reviewed thousands of complex commercial real estate acquisitions. My eyes naturally scanned the document, looking for the specific escrow stipulations and financial timelines. I was initially just pretending to read it to make them sweat, but then my eyes locked onto a highly specific legal paragraph near the bottom of the second page. It was a preliminary release addendum. In commercial real estate deals of this massive size, the buyer often requires a non-refundable good faith deposit to lock in the exclusive purchasing rights while the final deed transfer is being processed. I knew this because my own corporate legal team at Horizon had drafted this exact standard clause. The addendum explicitly stated that Horizon Development Holdings had already wired a $1 million earnest money deposit directly into a private escrow account controlled by the seller. But that escrow account could not be legally unlocked without the explicit authorization of both deed holders. I stared at the thick black ink on the heavy legal paper. Right there at the bottom of the page, next to my father's messy signature, were my own initials, IR. My heart did a strange, heavy thud against my ribs. The initials were hastily scribbled in blue ink, trying to mimic the sharp, aggressive slant of my actual signature. It was a sloppy, desperate forgery. I kept my face completely blank, carefully processing the massive legal implications of what I was looking at. Richard had not just come here today to bully me into selling the property. He had already accepted the $1 million corporate deposit from Horizon. He had forged my legal initials to bypass the escrow security lock, and he had illegally transferred that massive sum of money directly into his own failing bank accounts. He had just committed federal wire fraud. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a shared inheritance. This was a severe federal crime with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. He had illegally defrauded a multi-billion-dollar investment firm using forged documents across state lines. If I handed this single piece of paper over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Richard would not just lose his house and his fancy cars. He would spend the next decade of his life wearing a federal prison uniform. I slowly looked up from the forged document. Richard was sweating profusely now, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He clearly thought I was just taking a long time to read the financial terms. He had absolutely no idea that I was staring directly at his ultimate destruction. Lydia cleared her throat loudly, breaking the heavy silence. "Well, Isabella," she said, tapping her designer shoe against the marble floor. "Are you going to sign it, or are we going to stand here all day watching you read? We have a very expensive lunch reservation to get to, and your father is extremely stressed." I looked at Lydia and then over at Isla. They were both glaring at me, completely oblivious to the radioactive bomb sitting on my desk. They honestly believed they were still in control of this situation. They thought they were strong, arming a stubborn daughter into submission. They did not realize that the man they were so fiercely defending had just handed me the loaded gun required to destroy all of their lives simultaneously. I needed to carefully secure this highly sensitive physical document immediately. I absolutely could not let him leave the building with the original forged copy. But I also could not let him know that I had discovered his massive crime today. I needed to trap him completely here first. I let out a slow, shaky breath, purposefully allowing my shoulders to slump. I needed them to believe that Isla's ridiculous threat of an elder abuse lawsuit had actually rattled me. I needed them to think the corporate armor had cracked just enough to let their familiar family manipulation seep back in. You are actually serious about dragging my name through a public civil court? I asked, my voice trembling just a fraction of an inch. A public lawsuit right now would trigger an internal compliance review at my firm. It could severely damage my standing with the executive board and ruin the reputation I have spent the last decade building. Richard immediately sensed what he thought was weakness. His chest puffed out again and the arrogant smirk returned to his deeply lined face. "We do not want to do that, Isabella," he said, adopting his fake, soothing, fatherly tone once more. "We simply want what is fair. We want to protect this family from unnecessary financial hardship. You sign the paper today, and the lawsuit disappears before it even gets drafted. You get $400,000 and everyone walks away completely satisfied with their fair share." I reached across the desk and slowly pulled the thick manila folder closer to me, casually resting my hand directly over the page containing my forged initials. I cannot just blindly sign a massive commercial real estate transfer without running it through my own legal counsel. "Richard," I said, shaking my head in feigned exhaustion, "my compliance department requires me to log all major personal asset liquidations. If I sign this right this second without a standard legal review, I could lose my corporate license. Give me 48 hours. Let my personal lawyers read the fine print to ensure I am not assuming any of your outstanding tax liabilities or hidden debts." Lydia rolled her eyes dramatically, crossing her arms tight against her chest. "Oh, please, Isabella," she scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "You are just stalling because you hate seeing us succeed. Horizon Development is not going to wait around while your fancy Manhattan lawyers drag their feet. They want this deal closed immediately so they can begin their construction planning." I looked at Lydia, and then shifted my icy gaze back to my father. "I am not stalling," I replied softly. "I am protecting myself legally. You are hosting your big retirement gala at the country club this Saturday night, correct? The one you have been bragging about to all your wealthy friends and the local real estate developers." Richard blinked, clearly surprised that I knew about his upcoming party. He had certainly not invited me. "Yes," he answered cautiously, narrowing his eyes. "It is a highly exclusive event. The entire country club board will be in attendance to celebrate my long career." "Perfect," I said, forcing a tight, compliant smile. "I will have my legal team fast-track the review of this contract tomorrow morning. I will personally bring the fully signed and notarized deed directly to your retirement party on Saturday night. You can hand it over to the escrow agent on Monday morning, and Horizon Development will transfer the remaining $7 million by Tuesday. You get your money to save your house, and I get my cut." Richard stared at me for a long moment, his greedy mind rapidly processing the timeline. The thought of receiving the signed deed right in the middle of his lavish party, surrounded by all of his elite peers, was simply too intoxicating for his narcissistic ego to resist. It would be his ultimate victory lap, proving to everyone that he still held absolute power over his wealthy, estranged daughter. "Fine," Richard agreed, slamming his hand proudly on the edge of my desk. "Saturday night. Do not be late, Isabella. And dress appropriately. It is a strict black tie event." He turned around and marched toward the heavy frosted glass doors, feeling like an absolute king. Isla shot me a sickeningly smug smile, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I told you that you would cave," she sneered quietly. "You always were weak when it really mattered." She linked her arm through Lydia's, and the two of them followed Richard out of my office, practically floating on air. I remained perfectly still in my chair, listening to the soft click of my office doors closing behind them. I watched the live security feed as the three of them stepped back into the private elevator. Richard was actually laughing, patting Isla proudly on the back. They were gloating, celebrating their massive triumph over the bitter, estranged daughter. Once the elevator doors sealed shut, I looked down at my desk. My hand was still resting firmly over the contract. I slowly slid the document closer, picking up the preliminary release addendum with my forged initials. Richard thought he had just successfully bullied me into handing over a fortune. He had absolutely no idea that he had just voluntarily surrendered the physical evidence of his own federal wire fraud directly into my hands, and he had just given me a very public stage to execute him on. Saturday night arrived at the Oak Creek Country Club where the air conditioning was blasting and the champagne was flowing freely. Richard had rented the most expensive event space in the county to celebrate his so-called retirement. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of round tables draped in heavy silk linens. Towering floral arrangements of rare white orchids sat at the center of every table. A jazz band played on an elevated stage, while waitstaff in white tuxedos circulated carrying silver trays of caviar. It was a breathtaking display of upper-class wealth, and it was entirely funded by the $1 million deposit he had illegally stolen from my firm. My private investigator, Evan, had already slipped inside the venue posing as an event photographer. He was quietly feeding me live updates through a secure earpiece as I sat in the back of my black town car parked idling out by the main gates. Through Evan's subtle camera lens, I could see the entire sickening spectacle unfolding in real time on the tablet resting in my lap. Richard was standing near the main bar holding court like a conquering king. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored tuxedo and holding a glass of scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Aunt Beth, Aunt Martha and Aunt Joni were huddled around him, hanging onto his every word as he loudly bragged to a group of local real estate developers. "I am telling you, gentlemen, it is all about reading the market," Richard boasted, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. When Horizon Development approached me about the Rhode Island property, I knew I had them right where I wanted them. They tried to lowball me initially, but I held firm. $8 million, pure cash. "You have to be willing to walk away from the table if you want to secure the real money." Aunt Martha patted his shoulder proudly. "We always knew you had a brilliant business mind, Richard," she cooed loudly, ensuring the wealthy developers heard her. "Your father would be so incredibly proud of the empire you have built." Across the ballroom, Isla was putting on her own disgusting display of stolen wealth. She was standing with a group of country club wives aggressively flaunting a massive new diamond tennis bracelet and a matching emerald necklace. The heavy jewels sparkled under the chandelier light. Evan zoomed the camera in, perfectly capturing the designer labels. Those pieces easily cost $50,000 combined. Money that Isla had undoubtedly siphoned directly from Richard's fraudulent deposit account the moment it cleared the bank. Andre was standing a few feet behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable in his dark suit. He kept checking his watch and rubbing the back of his neck, completely disconnected from his wife's obnoxious bragging. As a meticulous corporate defense attorney, Andre lived his entire life strictly by the book. He had absolutely no idea that the glittering diamonds hanging around his wife's neck were the direct proceeds of a federal wire fraud. He simply thought his father-in-law had finally closed a lucky, legitimate deal to save the family from bankruptcy. "Did Andre buy you that stunning necklace?" one of the wives asked Isla, leaning in to admire the emeralds. Isla let out a high-pitched, condescending laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, please no," she bragged loudly. "Andre does well at his law firm, but this is family money. My father gave me a very generous early inheritance advance to celebrate his massive commercial land sale. We are actually looking at buying a summer house in the Hamptons next month." Lydia was floating through the crowd nearby, wearing an outrageously expensive designer gown, and loudly telling anyone who would listen about the month-long luxury cruise she and Richard had just booked through the Mediterranean. They were all drunk on the illusion of limitless wealth. They were spending the stolen $1 million as fast as they could, desperately trying to plug the massive holes in their failing social status. Richard checked his gold watch and smirked. He looked incredibly smug. He was eagerly waiting for me to walk through those heavy mahogany doors and hand him the fully signed deed in front of his elite audience. He wanted his wealthy peers to witness my total submission. He wanted to prove that no matter how successful I had become, he still held the ultimate power over my life and my finances. I pulled my earpiece out and tossed the tablet onto the leather seat next to me. I looked at the driver in the rearview mirror and gave him a single sharp nod. "It is time," I said coldly. "Drive up to the front entrance right now." The heavy black town car rolled smoothly to a stop under the massive illuminated portico of the Oak Creek Country Club. A young valet in a crisp uniform rushed forward to open the rear door. I stepped out into the humid evening air, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored midnight black evening gown. It was a structured architectural piece that looked more like modern armor than traditional formal wear. Behind me, the opposite doors opened, and my two senior corporate litigators stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway. Mr. Gallagher and Miss Pierce were dressed in sharp, dark suits, carrying identical heavy leather briefcases. They looked exactly like what they were, which was highly paid corporate executioners. We walked past the valet stand, moving in perfect synchronization. The massive mahogany double doors were pulled open by two greeters, and we stepped directly into the grand ballroom. The sheer sensory overload of the party hit me immediately. The loud, upbeat jazz music, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the overlapping chatter of 200 wealthy guests filled the massive space. But as I walked past the velvet ropes flanked by two severe-looking attorneys, a strange ripple effect began to wash over the room. People naturally turned to look at the new arrivals. When they saw my completely unsmiling face and the heavy briefcases my lawyers carried, the conversations nearest to the entrance began to abruptly die out. The sudden drop in volume spread across the ballroom like a fast-moving wave. Within 60 seconds, the room was unnervingly quiet. The jazz band on the elevated stage noticed the sudden shift in the crowd and faltered slightly, missing a beat before the bandleader motioned for them to lower their volume to a soft background hum. Richard was standing near the towering ice sculpture at the center of the room, surrounded by Aunt Beth, Aunt Martha, and Aunt Joni. I watched his eyes lock onto me. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross his lined face when he registered the presence of my legal team. But his massive ego quickly overrode his fear. He assumed the lawyers were just my pretentious way of delivering the signed real estate contract. He forced a massive, blindingly fake smile onto his face and practically sprinted across the polished marble floor toward us. His arms were spread wide open, ready to perform the role of the loving father for his captive audience of elite country club peers. "Isabella, my darling daughter," he boomed loudly, his voice echoing in the awkwardly quiet room. He reached out and aggressively grabbed my upper arm, attempting to pull me into a tight, staged embrace. I immediately planted my heels into the floor and locked my elbow, completely refusing to move a single inch. My sudden physical resistance caused Richard to stumble forward slightly, ruining his graceful fatherly approach. The fake smile on his face strained so hard, it looked painful. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, leaning his face close to my ear so the nearby guests could not hear his sudden shift in tone. "Smile for these people, Isabella. You are embarrassing me in front of the board of directors. Come to the center of the room with me right now. They are all waiting to see us celebrate the big family deal. Where is the signed property deed? Give me the folder right now and tell these two corporate suits to wait outside." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then looked directly into his desperate, greedy eyes. "I am not going anywhere, Richard," I replied, my voice low and dangerously calm. "And my attorneys are staying exactly where they are. You wanted me to bring the legal documents to your party. I brought them. But we are not going to do this quietly in a corner. You invited all of your closest friends and business partners to celebrate your massive commercial real estate success. I think it is only fair that we address your entire audience together." Richard blinked rapidly, his grip tightening on my arm. His heart was starting to pound. He could sense that something was horribly wrong, but his brain refused to accept that I held any real power over him. Do not play games with me tonight, Isabella, he warned through clenched teeth, still forcing a wide, terrifying smile for the onlookers. Hand me the contract right now. Horizon Development is waiting for the escrow confirmation. You are going to ruin the entire sale if you cause a scene in front of my bankers. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward smoothly, inserting his large frame between me and my father. He casually placed a heavy hand on Richard's wrist, forcing him to release my arm. Please keep your hands to yourself, Mr. Reed, my attorney stated in a voice that was perfectly polite but laced with unmistakable threat. My client is ready to make her formal presentation to the room. Richard stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist, staring at the lawyer in absolute shock. Before my father could recover his wits and start yelling, I turned my back to him. I began walking purposefully toward the small, elevated stage where the jazz band was quietly playing. The crowd of wealthy guests parted in front of me, like the Red Sea whispering frantically to one another. Isla and Lydia were pushing their way to the front of the crowd, their faces twisted in confusion. The trap had been fully triggered. I reached the elevated stage and stepped onto the platform. The jazz band members quickly backed away. I walked directly to the heavy silver microphone stand positioned in the center of the stage. I gripped the microphone, sliding it off the stand. The soft feedback echoed through the massive ballroom. I looked out over the sea of wealthy guests. 200 eyes were locked on me. Richard stood frozen near the ice sculpture, his chest heaving. Isla and Lydia pushed their way to the front of the crowd, flanking him like confused bodyguards. Good evening, everyone, I began, my voice projecting clearly through the sound system. My name is Isabella Reed. I am Richard's daughter. I know my arrival tonight was a bit sudden, but I simply could not miss the opportunity to speak at my father's grand retirement celebration. A collective breath released in the room. The tension dropped. The wealthy guests exchanged polite smiles, assuming this was a dramatic family reconciliation. Richard visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping an inch. He smirked, crossing his arms, believing I was surrendering. He thought I was about to hand him the contract and sing his praises to save face in front of the elite crowd. My father knows how to put on a spectacular show. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. Just look at this magnificent party. The vintage champagne, the imported orchids, the beautiful jazz music. He has spent his entire career building a reputation as a highly successful commercial real estate investor. He wants you all to believe he is retiring at the absolute peak of his financial power. Aunt Beth and Aunt Martha nodded vigorously near the front row, pleased with my complimentary tone. Just last week, he secured an incredible deal, I said, holding up my empty hand for emphasis. An $8 million all-cash offer for a stretch of prime coastal land in Rhode Island. It was a brilliant negotiation. In fact, he was so confident in his success that he secured a massive $1 million earnest money deposit from the buyer. That exact deposit funded this lavish party tonight. It funded the luxury cruise he just booked. It funded the $50,000 worth of diamonds currently hanging around my sister Isla's neck. The crowd murmured in impressed agreement. Isla touched her emerald necklace, proudly beaming under the attention. Andre, however, frowned deeply, looking sharply at his wife. The math was not adding up in his legal mind. Yes, my father is a man of bold financial maneuvers, I said, my tone suddenly dropping an octave, losing all of its warmth. The icy shift in my voice cut through the ballroom like a knife. The smiles on the faces of the guests instantly vanished. But there is a very critical detail my father conveniently forgot to mention to his country club board members, his private bankers, and even his own family, I announced, staring directly into Richard's terrified eyes. That Rhode Island property is locked in an irrevocable co-ownership trust. It cannot be sold, transferred, or leveraged without the explicit physical signatures of both deed holders. He holds one half, I hold the other. Richard took a sudden step forward, his face turning the color of wet ash. Isabella, stop talking right now, he barked, his voice cracking with pure panic. I did not stop. I raised the microphone closer to my mouth. I have not spoken to my father in 3 years. I did not agree to this sale. I did not sign any preliminary release documents. Yet miraculously, my initials appeared on the escrow authorization forms last week. My father forged my signature to illegally unlock the corporate escrow account. He deliberately defrauded a commercial buyer to siphon $1 million directly into his own failing personal bank accounts. The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and shocked whispers. Several wealthy investors standing near Richard immediately took large steps away from him, treating him like he was highly contagious. "My father is not retiring tonight to enjoy his vast wealth," I stated cleanly, slicing through the rising noise of the crowd. "My father is completely bankrupt. His house is in active foreclosure. His credit cards are maxed out. He threw this party using stolen corporate funds. Richard Reed did not close a brilliant real estate deal. He committed federal wire fraud." Lydia let out a high-pitched shriek, dropping her crystal champagne flute. It shattered loudly against the marble floor. Isla looked like she was going to be physically sick. Richard was hyperventilating, his hands gripping his hair as his carefully constructed empire of lies completely vaporized in front of every single person he desperately wanted to impress. "Turn off that microphone right this second!" Lydia shrieked, her voice piercing through the heavy murmurs of the stunned crowd. She spun around wildly, pointing a trembling finger at the elevated sound booth located at the back of the ballroom. "Cut the audio," she demanded frantically, waving her arms at the young disc jockey who was standing frozen behind his mixing turntables. He immediately panicked and reached out to pull the master power switch down. But before his fingers could even graze the soundboard, Ms. Pierce, my second corporate attorney, calmly stepped out from the dark shadows of the booth. She firmly placed her hand over his wrist, shaking her head once. She had quietly secured the audiovisual controls the moment we walked through the front doors. My microphone remained perfectly live and crystal clear. "You cannot silence the truth by turning off a speaker, Lydia," I said calmly, my voice booming effortlessly over her panicked screaming. I pressed a small remote clicker hidden in the palm of my hand. Behind me, a massive white projector screen slowly descended from the high ceiling, completely covering the ornate stage backdrop. The lights in the ballroom automatically dimmed, plunging the wealthy guests into shadows, while the bright glow of the projector illuminated the room. A massive high-resolution image of a private banking statement flashed onto the screen. The specific account numbers were redacted, but the names and the staggering dollar amounts were magnified for everyone to see. While my father was busy committing federal wire fraud to steal $1 million from my firm, his loyal wife was busy committing her own massive financial heist, I announced, pacing slowly across the stage. I pressed the clicker again, highlighting a specific column of outgoing wire transfers. As you can clearly see on the screen, Richard deposited the stolen earnest money into his primary checking account exactly 7 days ago. But less than 48 hours later, exactly $500,000 was systematically siphoned out of that same account in a series of highly structured offshore transfers. Richard whipped his head around to stare at the massive screen, his eyes bulging out of his skull. He frantically patted his pockets as if checking for his phone or his wallet. "What is that?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Lydia, what did you do to my money?" Lydia was backing away from him, her face completely drained of color. She looked desperately toward the exit doors, but Mr. Gallagher was standing firmly in the main aisle, blocking her escape route. "It is a fake!" she cried out, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Izzy is lying, Richard. She forged those documents to tear us apart because she has always been jealous of me." "I am not the one forging documents tonight, Lydia," I replied sharply. I pressed the clicker a third time. The screen changed, displaying a highly detailed joint registration form for a private offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. The account was registered to Lydia Reed and a man named Trent Lawson. I read the name aloud, letting it hang in the dead silence of the ballroom. Trent Lawson. For those of you who do not frequent the exclusive fitness center here at the Oak Creek Country Club, Trent is Lydia's 26-year-old personal trainer. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed immediately by explosive whispers. Several wealthy women in the front row covered their mouths in absolute shock. Richard stumbled backward, physically, leaning against the towering ice sculpture to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He stared at his wife, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "You were not just stealing my father's fraudulent money, Lydia," I continued mercilessly, driving the final nail into her coffin. "You were secretly liquidating his remaining assets so you could run away with your boy toy." I pressed the clicker one last time. A pair of first-class electronic flight itineraries appeared on the bright screen. 2 one-way tickets to Belize departing tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. You booked these premium tickets yesterday afternoon using the stolen corporate funds. You were planning to board a plane while Richard was sleeping, leaving him completely bankrupt and waiting for the federal authorities to arrest him alone. Lydia clamped her hands over her face, sobbing hysterically. She could not formulate a single word of defense because the undeniable proof was glowing brightly right above my head. Richard let out a guttural sound of pure agony. The woman he had destroyed my childhood for, the woman he had stolen my college fund to impress, had just been exposed as a ruthless, greedy gold digger who was literally hours away from abandoning him to rot in a federal prison cell forever. The ballroom fractured into absolute bedlam. Richard let out an animalistic roar and lunged across the marble floor, grabbing Lydia by the shoulders of her gown. "You absolute parasite," he screamed, shaking her violently as her diamond necklace rattled against her collarbone. "I stole that money for you. I risked federal prison to keep you in luxury, and you were going to run away with a gym rat." Lydia cried out, struggling to push his heavy hands off her shoulders, but Richard was blinded by rage. He finally realized his entire life was a pathetic, hollow lie, built for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an automated teller machine. Several friends physically stepped back, refusing to intervene in the violent domestic dispute unfolding right in front of them. "Get your hands off her!" Isla shrieked, rushing forward and violently shoving Richard backward to protect her stepmother. Isla positioned herself between the warring couple, her face flushed with anger. She whipped her head around and glared up at me on the elevated stage, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Are you happy now, Izzy?" she screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "Look at what you have done to our family. You came here tonight specifically to destroy us. You manipulated those financial documents just to humiliate our father and ruin his marriage because you have always been a jealous person who hates our happiness." I leaned casually against the microphone stand, looking down at my sister with absolute pity. "I did not manipulate a single piece of paper, Isla," I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the chaotic ballroom. "The truth is simply a mirror, and you are all terrified of your own ugly reflections. But since you are so eager to defend thieves and liars tonight, let us take a brief look at your own financial integrity." I raised my hand and pressed the small clicker hidden in my palm. The massive projector screen behind me flashed brightly, immediately replacing Lydia's offshore banking records with a new set of legal documents. The crowd gasped again as a heavily redacted property deed and a commercial loan agreement illuminated the dark room. Andre, who had been standing frozen in absolute shock near the ice sculpture, suddenly stepped forward. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the specific street address printed in bold black letters across the top of the projected document. It was his own residential address. The colonial house in the suburbs that he had purchased entirely with his own money before he married Isla. "You love to pretend you are a wealthy socialite, Isla," I said, projecting my voice clearly so every country club wife could hear me. "You love flaunting your $50,000 emerald necklaces and bragging about buying summer homes in the Hamptons. But the truth is you have not contributed a dollar to your own marriage. In fact, you have been actively robbing your husband blind." I pointed to the signature line glowing brightly on the massive screen. 3 months ago, when Richard's real estate business first started missing loan payments, he came crying to you for a bailout. And instead of telling your husband the truth, you secretly forged his signature to take out a second mortgage on his house. The entire room went dead silent again. All eyes snapped toward Andre and Isla. "You illegally leveraged your husband's property to secure a $400,000 commercial bailout loan for Richard's failing business." I continued, mercilessly stripping away her fake wealthy facade piece by piece. You put your own husband's financial security and his immaculate legal reputation in severe jeopardy just to keep your father's sinking ship afloat for a few more months. And you did it all behind his back while he was working 80-hour weeks to provide you with a life of luxury. Isla's face collapsed. The aggressive, venomous energy that had fueled her entire life instantly vanished, replaced by a sickening terror. She slowly turned her head, looking over her shoulder at Andre. Her husband was standing rigid, staring up at the projector screen with a look of pure horror. His entire world was shattering right in front of his eyes. He realized the woman he shared a bed with was not just spoiled or entitled but criminally deceptive. I watched the moment Andre's deep love for my sister died. He slowly lowered his gaze from the screen and looked directly into Isla's panicked, tear-filled eyes. Isla opened her mouth to speak, her hands shaking as she reached out toward him. "Andre, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the projector. "Let me explain." But there was absolutely nothing left to explain because the undeniable proof of her betrayal was lighting up the country club. Andre did not scream or throw a violent tantrum like my father. Instead, he reacted exactly like the seasoned corporate defense attorney he was. He took 3 deliberate steps toward the massive projector screen, scanning the dense legal paragraphs of the commercial loan agreement. He searched for any possible loophole that might prove this was a misunderstanding. But the more he read, the harder his jaw clenched. He stared at the signature line where his own name had been flawlessly forged by his wife. He recognized her specific pen strokes and the notary stamp. The evidence was absolute and legally binding. Andre slowly turned away from the glowing screen and looked down at Isla. She was trembling violently, tears streaming rapidly down her face. She reached out, grasping the sleeve of his dark suit jacket. "Andre, it was only temporary," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully. "Dad swore he was going to pay it back next month with the Rhode Island money. I was trying to keep the family from falling apart. I did not want you to stress over it. I swear I was going to tell you the truth. Please do not look at me like that." Andre peeled her fingers off his jacket. "You did not want to stress me out," he repeated, his voice entirely hollow. "So you secretly leveraged the house I worked 15 years to pay off. You committed mortgage fraud and tied my legal name to a failing commercial business. You risked my career and my entire financial future to protect a man who just committed federal wire fraud to steal $1 million. Isla let out an agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the cold marble floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. Andre stood over her for a long moment, looking at the woman he had promised to spend his life with. Then he slowly raised his left hand. Without hesitation, he pulled his heavy platinum wedding band off his finger. He dropped the ring directly onto the floor in front of her. It hit the marble with a sharp ping that echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. "I will have my associates draft the divorce papers by Monday morning," Andre stated loudly, ensuring every person in the room heard his verdict. "Do not come back to my house, Isla. My security team will box up your things and leave them on the front porch. We are completely done." Andre turned on his heel and walked straight down the center aisle, heading for the main exit. He did not look back once. Isla collapsed, curling into a ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The wealthy country club wives, who had just been admiring her expensive emerald necklace, were now staring at her with undisguised pity and disgust. While the crowd was captivated by Isla's pathetic breakdown, I noticed movement near the back of the room. Aunt Beth, Aunt Martha, and Aunt Joni were attempting to execute a coordinated tactical retreat. The 3 women who spent my entire life loudly demanding respect were currently hunched over, trying to quietly shuffle their way toward the heavy exit doors. They wanted to slip away into the night and pretend they had absolutely nothing to do with this catastrophic humiliation. I raised the microphone back to my lips. "Going somewhere, Aunt Beth," I called out, my voice booming through the sound system. All 3 aunts froze instantly like deer caught in headlights. The entire crowd pivoted to look at them standing awkwardly near the exit. I stepped to the very edge of the stage, looking down at them with absolute contempt. 3 years ago, you three women crashed my rehearsal dinner to publicly humiliate me, I announced, staring directly into Aunt Beth's terrified eyes. You screamed at me in front of my future in-laws. You demanded that I apologize to Richard for setting basic boundaries. You called me a cold, heartless monster for refusing to bow down to this exact man who is standing here bankrupt and facing federal prison. Aunt Martha tried to shrink behind Aunt Joni, her face bright red. Aunt Beth opened her mouth to defend herself, but no sound came out. You spent decades enabling Richard's toxic behavior, I continued relentlessly. You constantly praised his fake wealth and happily helped him tear me down whenever I refused to play your sick family games. You told me I was bringing shame to the Reed family name. I swept my arm across the stage, gesturing to the crying stepmother, the sobbing sister, and the hyperventilating father. Take a good look at your beloved family now, ladies. This is the legacy you proudly defended. I hope you enjoy explaining this spectacular mess to your social circle tomorrow morning. Aunt Beth let out a strangled sob of humiliation before grabbing her designer clutch and practically sprinting through the heavy mahogany doors. Aunt Martha and Aunt Joni followed close behind her, shoving past the bewildered waitstaff to escape the searing judgmental glares of their wealthy peers. The three women who had terrorized me for my entire life were finally gone, chased out of the country club by their own overwhelming shame. They had spent decades building their fragile social standing in this exact community, and in less than 10 minutes, I had completely dismantled it. I watched the doors swing shut behind them, feeling a profound sense of closure. But the main event was far from over. Richard was still standing near the melting ice sculpture, breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. He slowly turned his head, taking stock of the absolute devastation surrounding him. His younger wife was exposed as a thieving opportunist who was planning to abandon him by sunrise. His golden child daughter was currently sobbing on the marble floor, completely abandoned by the wealthy husband she had just criminally defrauded. His elite country club friends, the people he had spent millions of dollars trying to impress, were actively whispering to one another, pulling out their phones to text the scandalous gossip to everyone in their exclusive social circles. His pristine upper-class reputation was permanently incinerated, and towering over all of that social ruin was the massive, terrifying shadow of the federal government. Richard finally snapped out of his shock and realized the acute legal danger he was in. If the $1 million corporate deposit from Horizon Development was not immediately legitimized by a finalized property sale, he was going straight to a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud. The bank would seize his house, the corporate lawyers would freeze his accounts, and the authorities would publicly arrest him. His eyes darted frantically around the room before locking onto me standing elevated on the stage. The arrogant, tyrannical patriarch who had disowned me via text message was entirely gone. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate old man. Richard stumbled forward, practically tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. He pushed past the silent crowd, ignoring the disgusted looks from his former friends, and stopped right at the edge of the stage, looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "Isabella." He choked out, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Isabella, please listen to me. You have made your point. You exposed Lydia and you exposed Isla. You won. You completely won." I stared down at him, keeping my face perfectly composed. "I am not playing a game, Richard," I replied coldly. "There is nothing to win here. This is simply the inevitable consequence of your own greed." He frantically shook his head, reaching up to grip the edge of the wooden stage. "No, you do not understand," he pleaded desperately. "If that sale does not go through on Monday morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be at my front door. Horizon Development is a massive corporate entity with ruthless lawyers. They will destroy me. They will lock me in a cage for the rest of my life." He was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his custom tuxedo now clinging awkwardly to his shaking frame. "Give me the signed contract, Isabella," he begged, his voice cracking loudly in front of the entire ballroom. "I know you brought it. You told me you were having your attorneys review it. If you hand me that signed deed right now, the escrow account is officially authorized. The $1 million deposit becomes a legally binding transaction. I can cover up the missing money. I can fix the paperwork before the bank flags the fraud. Please. I did not move a single muscle. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief, aggressively wiping the sweat from his forehead. I will give you more money, he babbled, frantically negotiating with a ghost. Forget the 5%. I will give you half. I will give you $4 million in pure cash. You can take Lydia's share. You can take Isla's share. Just give me the paper so I can close the deal. We are family, Isabella. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to federal prison over a simple misunderstanding. The sheer audacity of his words echoed through the silent room. He was still trying to buy his way out of the consequences. He was willing to throw his wife and his favorite daughter completely under the bus, offering me their cuts of the money without a second thought, just to save his own skin. He dropped to his knees on the hard floor right in front of the stage. The wealthy developers and country club board members watched in absolute shock as Richard Reed, a man who had spent decades projecting an image of untouchable power, openly groveled at my feet. Please, Izzy, he wept. I am begging you, hand me the contract. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the marble floor. The great Richard Reed, the master manipulator, the wealthy patriarch of the family, was completely shattered. He was weeping like a child, grasping at the hem of my gown with shaking hands. I slowly pulled my dress out of his desperate grip and took a half step back. I looked at the tears streaming down his face and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no familial obligation. The well of my empathy had dried up a very long time ago. Do you remember the text message you sent me the morning before my wedding, Richard? I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. The entire room hung onto my every word. You waited until I was standing in my wedding dress preparing for the happiest day of my life to drop your bomb. You told me that if I did not force Lydia's children into my bridal party, you simply did not have a daughter. You called me incredibly selfish. You told me not to expect you to walk me down the aisle, and you explicitly ordered me to never bother coming to your house ever again. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently as if trying to physically block out the memory of his own cruelty. I did not mean it, he sobbed weakly. I was just angry, Isabella. I was just trying to keep the peace with Lydia. Please forgive me. You told me to consider it your final goodbye? I continued, speaking over his pathetic whimpers. You pulled a $50,000 catering check hours before the vendors arrived, hoping to completely ruin my wedding day. You ended that message by telling me to have a nice life. And that is exactly what I did, Richard. I built a spectacularly nice life. A life entirely free of your constant financial abuse, your endless manipulation, and your toxic narcissistic demands. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looming over him. For my entire childhood, I watched you prioritize everyone else over your own flesh and blood. You drained my college trust fund, the money my mother left for my education, just to buy a luxury vehicle for a boy who is not even your son. You watched Isla and those 3 bitter aunts humiliate me at my rehearsal dinner, and you did absolutely nothing to stop them. You demanded that I pay you back for the basic cost of raising me. You used your money as a weapon to keep me starving for your validation. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You thought I would always be the weak, desperate little girl begging for your approval. You never imagined I would become the predator. Richard looked up at me, his tear-streaked face twisting in profound confusion. What are you talking about? He whispered. Just give me the signature, Izzy. The buyers are waiting. Horizon is going to ruin me. I let out a soft, chilling laugh. That is the greatest irony of all, Richard. You are so utterly consumed by your own greed that you never even bothered to look into the corporate structure of the company you were desperately trying to sell my grandmother's land to. You saw an $8 million cash offer, and you blindly lunged for the bait. You forged my signature on federal escrow documents thinking you were defrauding a faceless corporate entity in Delaware. I crouched down on the edge of the stage, bringing my face level with his. Horizon Development Holdings is a subsidiary of Summit Capital, I said, speaking very slowly, ensuring every single syllable pierced his brain. and Summit Capital is fully owned and operated by Vanguard Crest. My division. My firm. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. His jaw dropped open and the color completely drained from his lips. The gasps from the country club board members standing nearby were highly audible. They realized the massive scope of the trap. I am Horizon Development. Richard, I whispered harshly, my words cutting through the dead silence of the ballroom. I am the buyer. I authorized the $8 million offer. I am the one who wired the $1 million deposit into that escrow account. You did not defraud a group of anonymous investors. You committed federal wire fraud against your own daughter. You stole $1 million directly from my corporate treasury. And I have every single forged document, every bank statement, and every IP address, logged and certified by my legal team. Richard's hands flew to his chest as if he were having a sudden heart attack. He gasped for air, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood the absolute scale of the trap I had built for him. There was no faceless corporation to negotiate with. There was no legal loophole to exploit. He had handed the murder weapon directly to the executioner. You wanted me to bring the signed contract tonight, I said, standing back up and looking down at his trembling form. You wanted to prove to all your wealthy friends that you still owned me. Well, Richard, you are about to get exactly what you asked for. Richard collapsed entirely, falling forward until both of his knees hit the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. The heavy impact echoed in the silent ballroom, but he did not even seem to feel the physical pain. His body was shaking violently, his chest heaving with loud, ragged sobs that sounded more like a dying animal than a human being. He grabbed the sides of his head, pulling at his perfectly styled hair, completely destroying the expensive tailored image he had spent the last 3 decades meticulously crafting. The reality of his impending federal prison sentence crashed over him like a suffocating tidal wave. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that there was no corporate loophole to exploit and no sleazy legal maneuver to save him. The multi-billion-dollar holding company he had proudly defrauded was entirely controlled by the daughter he had treated like worthless garbage. The 200 wealthy guests standing around us were absolutely paralyzed. These were powerful real estate developers, prominent local politicians, and elite country club board members who had spent years admiring Richard's aggressive business tactics. Now they were watching the great patriarch of the Reed family completely unravel in real time. Nobody stepped forward to help him. Nobody offered a word of comfort. They simply stared down at him with an icy mixture of profound shock and deep disgust. The lavish party he had funded with stolen money had instantly transformed into his public execution chamber. "Isabella, please!" he wailed, his voice cracking so loudly it hurt my ears. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the fabric of my dress again, but my corporate attorneys immediately stepped closer, creating an impenetrable wall between us. He was forced to look up at me from the floor, his face red and slick with sweat and tears. "Please, Izzy, I am your father," he screamed, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers above us. "We are family. You cannot do this to me. You cannot send your own father to a federal penitentiary." I stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic, desperate words hang in the freezing air of the ballroom. I slowly looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, and then brought my gaze back down to the broken man sobbing at my feet. Family. I repeated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human warmth. You keep using that word tonight, Richard, as if it possesses some kind of magical power to erase decades of financial abuse and psychological torture. But you do not actually know what that word means. You have never known what it means. To you, family was just a convenient collection of human props. I continued, speaking clearly, so the microphone captured every single syllable. Family meant having an obedient audience to applaud your fake wealth. It meant having a scapegoat to blame whenever your own terrible financial decisions blew up in your face. You loved Isla because she blindly validated your massive ego even while she was secretly forging her own husband's signature to bail out your failing businesses. You loved Lydia because she looked great on your arm at country club dinners, even though she was actively draining your bank accounts to run away with another man. And you hated me because I saw right through your pathetic hollow facade from the very beginning. Richard let out a loud, agonizing groan, burying his face in his hands. I did my best, Isabella, he cried out weakly. I tried to provide for all of you. You tried to provide for your own ego, Richard, I corrected him sharply, my voice echoing through the silent room. You stole my college trust fund because you wanted to play the role of the generous savior for your new wife. You disowned me the day before my wedding because you could not stand the fact that I was establishing boundaries that did not directly benefit you. You completely abandoned me when I had absolutely nothing, and now that you are bankrupt facing federal wire fraud charges and staring down a decade in prison, you suddenly want to remind me that we share the same blood. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, stopping right at the edge of the elevated stage. You do not get to weaponize the concept of family only when you are terrified of the legal consequences of your own criminal actions, I stated coldly. You made your choice 3 years ago when you sent me that text message and pulled your money from my wedding. You chose your pride and your greed over your daughter. Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with blind panic. He knew my words were absolutely true, and he knew he had completely run out of emotional ammunition. He clasped his hands together, holding them up toward me in a gesture of pure, desperate supplication. I will do anything, Izzy, he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic hoarse whisper. I will sign whatever you want. I will transfer the house to you. Just give me the signed deed so I can authorize the escrow money. Please save my life. I stared down at him, watching the sheer terror radiating from his entire body. The ultimate power dynamic shift was completely finalized. The arrogant tyrant was dead, and only a terrified criminal remained. I slowly reached down, grabbing the small designer clutch resting on the microphone stand. I unclasped the metal latch and slipped my fingers inside, feeling the thick folded edges of the physical real estate contract he was desperately begging for. I pulled the thick manila envelope from my black leather clutch. The heavy paper rustled loudly against the microphone, amplifying the sound across the completely silent ballroom. Richard's eyes locked onto the envelope like a starving man staring at a feast. A sickening glimmer of hope suddenly sparked in his tear-filled eyes. He actually believed his pathetic display of weeping had worked. He thought my intentional hesitation was a sign of lingering daughterly affection, and that I was finally going to hand over the key to his absolute salvation. He reached up with both hands, his palms facing the ceiling, ready to receive the document. Thank you, Izzy, he whispered, his voice shaking with intense relief. Thank you so much. I promise you I will make this right. I will pay you back every single cent. We can start over. I kept my grip firmly on the envelope, looking down at his outstretched hands. I am a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless venture capital firms on Wall Street, Richard said, my voice projecting clearly over his pathetic babbling. I manage multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisitions on a daily basis. Do you honestly believe I would leave a highly sensitive commercial real estate contract sitting unverified in my purse until a Saturday night country club party? The sudden glimmer of hope in his eyes began to instantly flicker and fade. His hands remained frozen in the air. What are you saying? He asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. I am saying that I am an incredibly efficient executive, I replied smoothly. I do not play games with federal escrow accounts, and I certainly do not wait for a chaotic family gathering to execute legally binding decisions. I made my final decision regarding your fraudulent real estate transaction at exactly 9 o'clock yesterday morning. And unlike you, I did not forge anything. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. You signed it, he asked desperately, grasping at the only logical conclusion his greedy brain could process. You signed the release yesterday morning. I had my corporate legal team draft a formal and irrevocable response to Horizon Development Holdings, I explained, taking a deliberate step away from him. I had the document officially notarized in my Manhattan office. And then I personally faxed the final binding response directly to the escrow agency and the federal compliance officers handling the Rhode Island property transfer. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. They were seasoned businessmen, and they fully understood the absolute finality of a notarized corporate fax. The deal was already completely sealed and recorded by the state. The only question remaining was what exactly I had submitted to the authorities. Richard pushed himself up slightly, his knees still resting on the hard marble floor. He stared at the envelope in my hand, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "What did you send them, Isabella?" he demanded, a fresh wave of absolute panic bleeding into his voice. "Tell me what you signed. The escrow deadline is Monday morning. If they reject the paperwork, the federal authorities will be notified immediately." "I am well aware of the federal timeline," Richard I said coldly. "That is exactly why I brought you a courtesy copy of the finalized document tonight. I want you to see exactly what you earned." I pulled the crisp white contract out of the manila envelope. I did not hand it to him. Instead, I held it out over the edge of the elevated stage and simply opened my fingers. The heavy legal document slipped from my hand. It fluttered through the air in agonizing slow motion. The bright stage lights caught the white paper as it drifted downward, landing softly on the polished marble floor directly between Richard's expensive leather shoes. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see the final verdict of the Reed family empire. Richard lunged forward like a starving feral dog, throwing his entire upper body onto the floor to grab the paper. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, his expensive custom tuxedo wrinkling against the cold stone. He snatched the document with violently shaking hands and held it up to his sweaty face. He completely ignored the dense legal paragraphs detailing his massive fraud and immediately flipped to the very last page. He was desperately searching for the one thing that could keep him out of a maximum security federal penitentiary. He needed to see my legal signature authorizing the release of the stolen escrow funds. The camera lens of my private investigator's hidden device zoomed in, perfectly capturing the exact moment Richard's eyes found the bottom of the page. The high-definition image was simultaneously broadcast onto the massive projector screen hanging above the stage for every single person in the ballroom to witness. There was the standard printed line for the co-owner's signature, but the space was not filled with my elegant cursive name. It was not filled with the hastily scribbled initials he had tried to forge earlier that week. Instead, written across the legal signature line in thick, bold red ink were exactly 2 words: "Not family." The words were written in a thick, aggressive crimson ink that bled slightly into the heavy legal paper. They were enormous, stretching entirely across the bottom of the page, completely dominating the signature line. They were not written in my elegant cursive. They were written in stark, sharp block letters. The visual impact was absolutely undeniable. Richard stared at those 2 red words. His brain struggled to process the sheer finality of what he was looking at. He blinked rapidly, as if expecting the red ink to magically morph into my signature. But the letters remained exactly as they were. A permanent, legally binding rejection. "Not family. This is what you faxed to the escrow agency," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "This is what you submitted to the federal compliance officers." "That is exactly what I submitted, Richard," I confirmed, my voice ringing clear and steady over the hushed crowd. The escrow agency immediately rejected the transfer of the deed because my signature was explicitly withheld. Since the transfer was rejected, the $1 million earnest money deposit you illegally unlocked using my forged initials was automatically flagged by the federal banking compliance system. Horizon Development Holdings, my firm, officially filed a report for wire fraud at noon today. The money you spent on this lavish party tonight, the money Isla used to buy her diamonds, the money Lydia used to book her flights, it is all stolen corporate property. A low, terrified groan escaped Richard's throat. He dropped the piece of paper, letting it flutter back to the marble floor. He curled in on himself, wrapping his arms tightly around his stomach, as if he had been physically disemboweled. The reality of his complete destruction was absolute. He had lost everything. His wealth, his home, his wife, his golden child, daughter, his elite social standing, and very shortly, his physical freedom. Isla, who had been crying quietly near the edge of the stage, suddenly scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She grabbed the edge of my dress, looking up at me with mascara-streaked tears running down her face. "Izzy, please," she begged, her voice a desperate high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to fix this. Andre is leaving me. He is divorcing me. I have nothing left. You have all the money. You own the company. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave Dad permission to use the deposit. Please, Izzy, I am your sister. We grew up together." I looked down at her, feeling a cold wave of absolute detachment. "You only remember we are sisters when you need me to save you from your own terrible choices." "Isla," I said, pulling my dress out of her grip. "When you were standing in my office yesterday threatening to sue me for elder abuse, you did not care that we were sisters. When you were sitting at my rehearsal dinner watching those miserable aunts humiliate me, you did not care that we were sisters. You and Richard built this toxic empire of lies together. Now you get to watch it burn together." Lydia was still standing frozen near the exit aisle, her expensive designer gown now looking utterly ridiculous on her trembling frame. She realized that without the stolen money, she had absolutely no way to escape to Belize with her personal trainer. Her entire parasitic lifestyle was over. She was tied to a bankrupt felon who was about to be federally indicted. Richard slowly raised his head, looking up at me with completely hollow, dead eyes. "Why," he rasped. "Why did you have to destroy us completely, Isabella? You could have just walked away. You could have just kept your money and left us alone." "I did walk away, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, chilling calm. "3 years ago, when you sent me that pathetic text message disowning me, I walked away, and I built a beautiful life without you. You were the one who could not accept it. You were the one who illegally forged my initials to steal $1 million from my firm because your ego could not handle the fact that you were failing. I did not destroy you, Richard. I simply held up a mirror and forced you to look at the monster you have always been. You destroyed yourself." The sudden sound of heavy boots echoing across the cobblestone driveway outside cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting an eerie strobe effect across the terrified faces of the wealthy country club guests. The authorities had arrived exactly on schedule. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a violent thud that reverberated over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. 6 uniformed police officers marched directly into the room, led by 2 plainclothes federal agents wearing stern expressions and dark windbreakers. The pulsating red and blue lights from their cruisers outside cast long, erratic shadows across the imported marble floor. The soft jazz music had completely stopped, leaving only the sharp sound of heavy boots advancing toward the center of the room. The country club elite. The people who had spent the last 3 hours drinking Richard's stolen champagne immediately scrambled out of the way. They pressed their backs against the walls, holding their breath, absolutely desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive center of the room. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward to intercept the lead federal agent. He smoothly reached into his suit jacket and produced a thick stack of finalized legal briefs. "Good evening, Agent Miller," my attorney said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who orchestrated this exact moment. "I am the senior corporate counsel representing Horizon Development Holdings and Vanguard Crest. As per our phone call this afternoon, here are the verified banking logs, the forged preliminary escrow releases, and the notarized affidavits confirming the unauthorized transfer of $1 million across state lines. The funds were illegally routed directly into the personal accounts of the man kneeling right over there." Mr. Gallagher pointed a single steady finger at Richard. The lead agent took the file, quickly scanning the top page before giving a sharp nod to his uniformed officers. "Move in," he ordered, his voice cutting through the thick tension of the ballroom. 2 officers stepped past the towering ice sculpture and flanked Richard. He was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the piece of paper with the words, "Not family," written in red ink. He did not fight them, he did not scream, he did not attempt to negotiate. All the fight had completely drained out of him, leaving nothing but an empty, broken shell. "Stand up, Mr. Reed," one of the officers commanded, grabbing him firmly by the bicep and hauling him to his feet. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, forgery, and the grand theft of corporate assets." Richard swayed unsteadily on his feet, his expensive custom tuxedo hanging awkwardly off his slumped shoulders. The officer sharply twisted his arms behind his back. The loud metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly in the silent room. It was the absolute final sound of the Reed family empire collapsing. The man who had spent his entire life obsessed with projecting an image of untouchable upper-class wealth was now standing in the center of the most exclusive country club in the county, wearing handcuffs like a common criminal. I stood on the elevated stage watching the scene unfold with absolute cold precision. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me one last time. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely stripped of their arrogant pride. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words died in his throat. He finally understood that there was no manipulation left to deploy. The officers grabbed his shoulders and began marching him down the center aisle, forcing him to walk the gauntlet of his disgusted former friends and business partners. The wealthy developers who had been praising his business acumen 20 minutes ago now turned their heads away in pure revulsion. While the crowd was fixated on Richard's humiliating perp walk, Lydia saw a fleeting window of opportunity. She knew the offshore bank accounts were frozen and her flight to Belize was worthless, but the instinct of a true parasite is to always flee a dying host. She quietly hitched up the skirt of her heavy designer gown and tried to slip through the side exit leading to the catering kitchens. She was moving fast, her diamond earrings practically vibrating as she desperately tried to escape the fallout. But Ms. Pierce, my second attorney, was already standing in front of the swinging kitchen doors. She crossed her arms, blocking the path. "Going somewhere, Lydia?" she asked coldly. Lydia stumbled to a halt, her face turning a sickly shade of white. "Get out of my way," she hissed, trying to push past the lawyer. "I have absolutely nothing to do with his business. I am a victim here. He lied to me." "You are not a victim, Lydia," I called out from the stage, drawing the attention of the remaining officers. "You are an active accomplice." The second federal agent immediately peeled away from the main group and intercepted Lydia, grabbing her arm, just as she tried to make a frantic dash for the patio doors. "Ma'am, you are not going anywhere," the agent stated firmly, pulling out a second pair of handcuffs. "We have highly detailed logs of you attempting to wire stolen corporate funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. You are being detained as a material witness and an accessory to federal fraud." Lydia let out a piercing theatrical scream, thrashing wildly against the agent's grip. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her face. "I am accustomed to a certain lifestyle. I cannot go to jail. I need to call my personal trainer." The entire room watched in absolute disgust as the glamorous stepmother was wrestled into steel cuffs, her expensive gown tearing slightly at the seam as she was dragged kicking and screaming out the front doors right behind her bankrupt husband. Isla remained completely frozen on the floor, her hands covering her mouth as she watched both her father and her stepmother being hauled away by the police. She was entirely alone now. Her husband Andre had abandoned her. Her parents were heading to federal holding cells. The stolen money she used to buy her status was gone. She slowly looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The fake kingdom they had built was entirely gone, and I was the one holding the match. I looked down at Isla one final time. She was curled on the marble floor, a pathetic heap of ruined silk and stolen diamonds. There was no rage left in her eyes, only the crushing emptiness of a woman who finally had to face reality without a financial safety net. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer a parting word of advice. She had made her own terrible choices, and now she would have to live in the desolate wasteland she helped create. I turned away from her and calmly stepped off the elevated stage. The remaining country club guests parted from me silently. There were no hushed whispers now, only wide eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of fear and profound respect. They were looking at me not as Richard Reed's estranged daughter, but as a corporate titan who had just flawlessly executed the most surgical dismantling of a family empire they had ever witnessed. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Mr. Gallagher and Miss Pierce fell into step right behind me, their briefcases swinging in perfect synchronization. We bypassed the shattered champagne glass and the remnants of the lavish party without breaking our stride. As we moved through the grand lobby, I saw Richard and Lydia being aggressively loaded into the back of two separate police cruisers. The flashing red and blue lights painted their terrified faces in harsh alternating colors. Richard looked up, catching a final glimpse of me walking through the heavy glass doors. He opened his mouth perhaps to issue one last pathetic plea or a desperate curse, but the uniformed officer firmly slammed the cruiser door shut, instantly cutting off his voice. I did not break my stride. I did not look back. The heavy dark chapter of the Reed family was permanently closed. I stepped out from under the massive portico and took a deep breath of the crisp evening air. It tasted incredibly sweet. The suffocating toxicity that had plagued my entire childhood was finally gone, carried away in the back of a police car. The black town car was idling quietly at the edge of the cobblestone driveway. The young valet rushed forward to open the rear door, shooting me a nervous, awestruck glance. I offered him a polite, genuine smile and slid into the plush leather seat. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the vehicle. As the driver smoothly pulled away from the Oak Creek Country Club, my phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a secure notification from Vanguard Crest's Elite Legal Division. A high-priority email from the Rhode Island County Clerk's office was attached, because Richard was now officially indicted for federal wire fraud involving that specific property. And because he had defaulted on his secondary bank loans, his legal claim to the estate had been completely voided by the state. The irrevocable trust had automatically triggered its default clause. The message on my screen was crystal clear. The $8 million coastal property my grandmother left behind had been fully and legally transferred to my sole ownership. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and let out a long, slow breath. My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing when she drafted that paperwork. She knew Richard would eventually try to steal the land to fund his ego, and she gave me the exact legal armor required to stop him. The land was completely safe now. It would never be turned into a cheap commercial strip mall or liquidated to pay off a greedy stepmother's credit card debt. It would remain pristine, a quiet, beautiful sanctuary by the ocean exactly as she had intended. I opened my private banking application on my phone. The balance was staggering, a testament to years of relentless hard work and sharp instincts. But tonight, I wanted to use that power for something entirely different. I navigated to a specific saved account profile. It was a national charity organization dedicated to providing immediate legal counsel, safe housing, and financial literacy training to young adults who had survived severe financial abuse from their own parents. It was an organization that helped people who were exactly like I used to be, scared, broke, and desperately trying to escape a highly toxic family dynamic. I tapped the screen, setting up a massive, irrevocable wire transfer. It was a personal donation large enough to fund their entire legal defense department for the next 5 years. The banking system prompted me for a final security confirmation. Without a single microsecond of hesitation, I hit approve. The green confirmation checkmark illuminated my face in the dark cabin of the car. A genuine, profound smile spread across my lips. It was a smile born of pure, unadulterated freedom. I locked my phone and looked out the tinted window. The sprawling, dark suburbs of Connecticut quickly faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering, brilliant lights of the Manhattan skyline rising in the distance. I was finally heading home.